Welcome to the Turnpike Sports Spotlight. Dave Weishuttle with you. Anyone who have seen pictures of the studio that I'm in knows I'm sitting in front of a picture of Pac-Man. It's from a time when video games were a little more simple. Nowadays, one of the most popular and interesting video games is the Red Dead Redemption series, and a fascinating new book has just come out that really takes an in-depth look at the game. The book is called Red Dead Redemption: History, Myth, and Violence in the Video Game West from John Wills and Esther Wright. It's an incredible look at the game, and we're going to find out all about it because on the line we have John and Esther to tell us all about it. John and Esther, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Hello there.
Oh, it's great to have you both. And first off, congratulations. It's an absolutely fascinating book. And I'm curious, before we start talking about the book itself, tell me about your backgrounds and what led you both to create a book about Red Dead Redemption.
Well, I'll go first.
Okay.
For me, I've been playing video games probably too long because you referenced, I think, Pac-Man.
Yeah.
I remember growing up playing Pac-Man. It's probably one of my earliest video game memories, playing it in arcades. And I've been, whether it's a good thing or bad, I've been playing video games kind of ever since. So for me, I suddenly realized, being an academic, that maybe I could work on games too, in that I'd been looking at other stuff for a while when I did my PhD quite a few years ago. And I started being interested in how video games present the United States. And, you know, I'd had training in US history, but I thought, how are these games relating to American culture?
Yeah, I mean, likewise, I grew up playing video games. It was good to kind of be able to put that to some sort of use when I started to study and to do my PhD.
See, we weren't wasting our time, right?
No, exactly. I'm very glad my parents never really did too much restricting of the time I could play video games. But yeah, I mean, I was, likewise had a real kind of fascination with how US history was sort of being represented in all kinds of media, but particularly sort of video games. And I think I started my PhD at a really good time when lots of people really started to think about what were games doing with different historical periods. So to think about American history in games, there's really no better company, I don't think, to look at and focus on than Rockstar Games, in terms of a company that's really just been so focused on doing different things with particularly kind of 20th century, more recently 21st century US history in their games. So that's how I come to this.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. And I just so everyone's on the same page who are listening to us, tell us about the game Red Dead Redemption. For people who haven't played the game, can you give us an idea of the plot and the settings, and why has this game become so incredibly popular? Esther, why don't you go first this time?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to kind of put this into a nice little neat sentence, because I think it's changed so much across the franchise as well in terms of the scope and ambition, but in many ways also really stayed the same. It is trying very hard as a franchise, especially in the kind of Red Dead Redemption from 2010 and Red Dead Redemption 2 from 2018, to be that kind of game that offers the kind of classic Western experience that really hits on all those kinds of touch points that people expect when they're going to, play a game that is about the history of the American West. So for the most part, for the kind of the most recent part of the franchise, these last two games, you follow the stories of some characters called John Marston in Red Dead Redemption and also Red Dead 2, and Arthur Morgan, and they've really become these kind of iconic sort of male, quintessential kind of like tough male outlaw characters, really. And these are these sort of, I think, kind of sympathetic but very kind of morally ambiguous characters that, are your insight onto this world. But it's really, it's become this game that's about experiencing lots of different kind of vignettes, lots of different parts of what people think of when they think of the history of the American West, lots of different kinds of landscapes, the classic sort of, shootouts and outlaw sort of violence and playing off against the law. But I think increasingly, while it's trying to tell that story about, how do you change from a life of crime? What does the American West mean to different people, and how at this very kind of pivotal point at the turn in the 20th century were these sort of ideas about the Wild West, was it becoming kind of more lawful? Were things sort of changing? And what was the position of these kinds of people who had made their life one way in a very sort of violent and lawless space? How did they fit into the kind of so-called modern America that was becoming what everyone's worldview at that point, right? So yeah, it's really, really difficult beyond sort of saying like, these are the characters, these are the kinds of places and spaces. They've become such rich texts that offer such different kinds of experiences. And like I said, are really trying to cater to everything you might expect when you think about a sort of Western experience.
Mm-hmm. John, tell us about the book itself. It's a compilation of articles from different writers with very interesting views on Red Dead Redemption. How did you go about choosing the material for this book, and how is the book arranged in terms of subject matter?
Okay, so Esther and I have known each other a while, and we've kind of collaborated before. So we had a chat about thinking about doing a book about Red Dead Redemption. It's such a famous game that it kind of needed to be done. And really we had a few kind of contacts and people that we knew already that were already kind of experts on the topic, experts on the West, working on video games. So we approached a range of authors to see what they could volunteer, because obviously, we've got our own takes on the game and on Rockstar, whereas these other scholars got very unique and different views on it too. So we kind of gathered them all, we kind of corralled them all, if you want a Western kind of motif, but brought them all together and saw what they could offer. And the project is quite kind of wide-ranging. We let them kind of choose what they're going to look at. So it ranges from things on kind of masculinity, gender aspects, through to, we had one academic work on the environment and how it represents that.
Yeah.
We thought also about bigger themes, about kind of ideas around American capitalism, the state of the USA, and how the game speaks to America, but also quite specific things too. One of the interesting pieces I really liked was about kind of how the game relates to ideas about medical health. So we tried to create a kind of smorgasbord really of kind of takes on the game.
And I think it really speaks to, just to kind of chime in, it really speaks to the richness of this game, all of these games, like this whole franchise, in terms of just the different kinds of approaches that we could have asked people to sort of consider. And, it's by no means a short book. There's lots of, it's quite expansive in terms of the different approaches it takes, but we could have easily doubled, tripled the size of this book in terms of just asking people to think about it from lots of different kinds of perspectives, because games, they are just so, games, historical games in general, they are so kind of multimodal. They do lots of different things. So we really had our work cut out for us, I think, just to slim it down to really a small number of chapters that we're trying to think quite expansively, but also quite specifically about the different sort of touchstones of these games.
I would love both of your opinions on this, because Esther, you touched on it a little while back. I mean, whenever we mention the Old West to people, they automatically have an idea of what we're talking about. And I'm sure these ideas and images that come to mind to people are formed through the books and movies, which a lot of people see. But those entities are through the eyes and imagery of writers and film directors. I mean, one of my dad's favorite channels on cable is something called Grit, which is the old Westerns, all the old Western movies and all the old Western TV shows. And if you look at all the different movies that are on the channel, a lot of the same actors are in different movies. So there's definitely a stereotypical type of character out in the Old West. How is the idea of a Western figure, especially male, treated in the Red Dead Redemption series? Does it embrace the ideas of the male-dominated culture we see in the movies and life in the West? And does it add or change to the stereotypes of the West or the frontier that a lot of people have of that time period?
I think, it really does embrace this very sort of stereotypical idea about the Western hero, and the Western genre as it's existed over 100 years, right, in books and films and TV and also now games. it's so much more complicated than that, right? But the kinds of things that we're so familiar with, the sorts of things that most people, even if they're not Western buffs, even if they've never seen a Western film or TV show, they probably have some idea that it's like certain kinds of people. It's John Wayne, it's Clint Eastwood, it's that kind of stereotypical kind of hard man, right? So yeah, the games, they really do play into that with their sort of their choice of main characters. And it's not even really just a kind of, it's a very specific kind of Western man as well. Like they clearly are drawing inspiration more from the kind of post-1960s, what people have called the sort of revisionist wave of American Westerns, very much after it becomes kind of Clint Eastwood, Man with No Name, that sort of thing, right? So they're really drawing on a period in the Western's history, very long and complicated history, that is taking a much more kind of darker and cynical sort of perspective on the Western. It's not so much the kind of triumphant sort of Western and cowboys and Indians that sort of the earlier John Wayne and those sorts of things Westerns was doing. So yeah, it's really kind of reducing down the stereotype to a very particular kind of Western man, in a very sort of very kind of like I said, cynical and dark and violent understanding of what the Western is. And it's kind of changed a little bit, and in terms of the kinds of characters that we see as being important to the story, that has sort of diversified and expanded over the course of the franchise. With Red Dead Redemption 2, you get more visible interaction with a wider range of women or Black Americans or Native Americans, for example. But really, you're still seeing this story and you're still having the perspective of these kind of white American men. And they are a very particular kind of, Western outlaw.
John,
I can follow up. Yeah, I can follow on with that too. I totally agree with Esther. I'm a big fan of Westerns, and I watched a huge amount growing up. And Shane's one of my favourite movies. And I think one of the appeals of people playing this game is that you're entering a Western. You feel as though you're entering a Hollywood Western yourself for the first time. And when I looked at Red Dead, on some levels, it reminded me of one of the first Westerns, like The Great Train Robbery, a silent film by Edwin Porter. Came out in 1903, and in that film, he basically kind of creates the Western genre through a number of scenes where there's a railroad kind of attack, and the villain in the movie, played by Justice D. Barnes, looks at the audience and shoots at him. Yeah. And there's kind of these set scenes of the Western, and the audience at that time, of course, they couldn't fire back. But with Red Dead Redemption, you, the player, can not only fire back, you can kind of annihilate everybody if you want to. It's your choice there, and I think that these sort of games, they really capture that excitement of what a movie kind of used to offer us. And in a sense, Red Dead almost kind of replaces the Hollywood Western in that degree, because now we have a choice of what to do. We're a participant, we're not the audience, and it's kind of updating what we know about the Western, really.
The one thing that really struck me was from one of your contributors, Shannon Lawler. She said one of the central themes that runs through Red Dead is fatherhood. I mean, the father teaches his son that, suffering's part of life, and it's up to the son to pick up the mantle of their father. Is that the central thrust of the game? Can you see that weaved through all the series of Red Dead? Is that the redemption part of the Red Dead Redemption?
I mean, yeah, potentially. It's definitely, Shannon's chapter in the book is great for sort of really getting to that thing that is so much the heart of what these characters experience. I mean, the story of kind of fathers and sons, and the kind of the cycle of sort of violence between fathers and sons is something obviously that runs through the wider Western genre, but it absolutely is core to the stories, or at least like the kind of the overarching stories that Rockstar have created for these games. With Red Dead Revolver, the first game, you've got this sort of really formative early moment where one of the main characters, Red Harlow, sees his father and mother being murdered. With Red Dead Redemption, the whole point of John Marston's sort of story arc in that game is to get back his wife and son, and to kind of think about how he's going to pass on this better life for his son Jack. And in Red Dead Redemption 2, there's really a kind of like multi-layered story about John and Arthur Morgan and their kind of father figure, Dutch van der Linde, who's sort of the leader of the gang, and his kind of slow descent into this kind of toxicity, I guess, and their attempt to sort of get away from the kind of almost like madness that the Dutch is descending into, while also sort of trying to father a much younger Jack Marston in that game. So I think, yeah, it's incredibly important to the motivations and the worldview of these characters.
Yeah, and I completely feel that way too. I think that Esther captures, what's going on there, and I think the game is also speaking to ideas and issues and crises about masculinity today. We've got a very clear sense of, on the one hand, toxic masculinity, but we've also got some creative explorations of fatherhood that are really popular in media at the moment. And, an older example is like Cormac McCarthy's The Road. But there's lots of examples whereby we're looking at what it means to be a father. And that can kind of, very much interest the male audience in a productive way. And as a father to my own 9-year-old, and kind of the worry about how you be a good parent and the challenge of that, these games can kind of touch on those little bit of emotional chords that we have in our everyday lives.
Beyond the white male characters in the game, I'm curious of how other groups are portrayed, like women, Native Americans, and African Americans. Let me first ask about how women are portrayed in the game. I mean, you mentioned the character John Marston. In the game, he's talking about his wife, and he said she's always been a woman in a man's world. Is that how the game portrays women in the West? I mean, how much of a role do female characters have in Red Dead Redemption?
Dare I start? Okay, I'll start.
Esther, you do the honor on this one. So.
Something that I think is really interesting about this franchise, as it's changed over sort of, I guess, nearly 15 years is the fact that, and something that I write about in my chapter in the book, is that in terms of the kind of agency that we see women having, and in terms of agency, I mean the ability you have to kind of control a character who is a woman and sort of do things in the game world as her. It kind of gets really worse since, from Red Dead Revolver to Red Dead Redemption 2. It's really interesting that in Red Dead Revolver, so, very early in the franchise, not necessarily a game in the franchise that's kind of often forgotten is part of it, because Red Dead Redemption and Red Dead 2 are so sort of technologically sophisticated and open world. But actually you get a choice of different playable characters in that game. And one of them is a woman. Called Annie Stokes, who you control to defend your farm from bandits. You actually have the agency to sort of perform those kind of classic Western actions, but as a woman character who's very, very capable in and of her own right. She's her own rancher. She does her own thing. In the Red Dead Redemption games, I mean, we do see a range of different characters who are women, but I think that quote that you mentioned about sort of women in a man's world is really kind of Rockstar's, I guess, philosophy for how they see women in a Western, because in Red Dead Redemption, it's sort of only one woman at a time, please. There are 3 really major female characters who are seen across the 3 different acts of the game. There's obviously John's wife. There's another, again, really capable rancher character called Bonnie McFarlane, who is really, I think, just a revision of the first character that we see in Red Dead Revolver, but you don't get to kind of play as any of these characters. You don't necessarily see the world from their point of view. You don't see this kind of Western history from their perspective. They're really kind of accessories, in a sense, to the central male character's story. And when we get to Red Dead Redemption 2, we really do see, again, these kind of very strong female characters like Sadie Adler, who becomes, a really important part of the Van der Linde gang in her own right. There are other sort of women who are part of the camp, including obviously John Marston's wife, Abigail. But again, they kind of have to fit, in a character like Sadie Adler, she has to sort of fit a male archetype. She has to, literally stop wearing the skirts and put on the trousers and get the gun to kind of like be an important and central part of the violence. So she has to become very kind of masculine in her presentation and her action. So yeah, I think that's interesting, the way that things have changed over time to become almost sort of giving less of a sense of more diverse kind of agency for women, and seeing them more as a kind of part of the sideline of the kind of very male story, rather than it being kind of their story in its own right.
John, what are your thoughts on women in Red Dead Redemption? Do you see an evolution of women characters in the game series?
I think it's, in a way, it's a little bit of a shame if we think that this game had, 8 years around that of development, and the attention to detail on some of the graphical realism, some of the scenes is absolutely mind-blowing, is incredible. And yet, to me, I think a lot more time could have been spent on showing the West as a diverse landscape of all peoples. And I do think it plays to kind of Rockstar's traditional kind of male lens, but it also speaks a little bit, I think, to one of those older myths of the kind of Western frontier, that it's a male landscape, that, historians only a few decades ago have kind of been rewriting women back into it, that it's a women's West as well, and that women and men were very much, part of that pioneering story. I think that the opportunity was there for this game to kind of show that, and it wouldn't have been necessarily a controversial thing to do that. So I do think that, if we're thinking about, Red Dead Redemption 3 ever, or some sort of game that explores the West on this level, that we could, the developers could do more on this. Yeah.
Well, John, why don't you take this one? How about Native Americans or African Americans? How are they portrayed in Red Dead Redemption? How do the game creators show these characters, and how do they depict their role in the West and in the frontier?
I think that, Esther can correct me on this, but I think that there's an element whereby they're including them to some degree. I forget the character, but we have one of the gang members is an African American, and you have kind of interactions with him throughout the storyline. You do favors for him. You try to find, I think it's a broken watch for the character throughout the story, and you have a bond with that character too. But in a sense, some of the game is again missing some opportunities, depictions of Native Americans, and again this touches on other media too. There's a kind of limited sense of the Native American point of view, the indigenous perspective. Often what we're getting instead is a kind of gamic and kind of white developer view on that topic, rather than it coming from those people. But this is a game, I should say, this is a game, not to be too harsh on it, this is obviously a game far better than older video games in the 1980s or 1990s, whereby you'd literally be looking at two white cowboys fighting it out, or you'd have a game level whereby your mission as a white cowboy would be to massacre a whole Native American village without any sense of reason. So there's more sophistication here and more diligence, but again, it could do more would be my take.
In terms of what John was saying too about women and historians kind of through the new Western history, for decades have been trying to kind of write lots more people back into the history of the American West. So I think the fact that we do get, we get more sort of Black American characters in Red Dead Redemption 2. They were basically none in Red Dead Redemption at all, which is obviously a massive improvement. And we still have two very similar storylines around the way that Native Americans become part of the story, and the way that almost the gang and the outlaw, the white men outlaws sort of try to kind of almost like co-opt the mission and co-opt the injustices that are being done to Native Americans to advance their own kind of to advance their own future, to kind of protect themselves. There is a kind of commentary there. There is bringing some kind of visibility to sort of the experiences of Native Americans in the West. But I think again, because of the kinds of people who are the kinds of men that are central to these stories, it's really reinforcing something that historians have been trying to get away from, that even sort of film and television has been a lot more trying to kind of tell different kinds of stories. This game is really reinforcing that it's not these kind of people's stories, that the history of the West is not their story, it's the history of very particular kinds of men. And that's what I think is really a missed opportunity to just be a little bit more kind of inclusive, and to revise the story in different kinds of ways that other media have already been doing.
You know, what's interesting about Red Dead Redemption is that it shows the characters doing usual everyday things. I mean, I guess a lot of people will call them mundane things. I mean, they're taking care of horses. There's someone digging for herbs for medicine. So boring everyday things are shown. I mean, does that increase people's expectation that there should be more historically accurate that they are with regards to their characters and with regarding situations involving stereotypes of the West? I mean, because they're depicting mundane things, do people expect accuracy in the storytelling? John, why don't you take this?
I think that's a good question. I'm not always sure whether the player kind of links the two things. They might do. This sense that when you're moving through a landscape in Red Dead Redemption, you end up accepting that your horse is going really slowly and you're having to spend half an hour going from one place to the other. You might cope with that better because you feel like, well, I'm actually in a realistic environment. I'm doing an everyday task. This is how it should be. The West is becoming a real world here for me in the game. And for some players, they probably do really embrace some of those everyday tasks as kind of feeling like they're living in the game. So, like you said, there's collecting herbs, there's cleaning, cooking, shaving, having a bath. All these things kind of are reinforcing that the game world can be your life, that you can lose yourself in the game. And in a way, that's one of the original kind of appeals, I think, about video games, that you can completely lose yourself in this, the perfect escapism. I would say, however, that for some other players, that kind of sense of the mundane, the everyday play, that also might irritate them, in that they might actually want a break from maybe cleaning or cooking. They might want to enter a video game in the evening and not want to do any work. They might want to actually just have some fun. And so there's a little bit of a tension there, I feel. And I think it also depends on how players feel about the game themselves.
Esther, what do you think? Does the mundane activity in the game create an expectation of the player that maybe more accuracy, more thorough depiction of how the West really was is put in their mind? I mean, does the mundane activity work against the game in some weird way?
I don't know. I think, as John was saying, I think, there will be those kind of players who are not up for that. They want kind of a lot more sort of frequent action. But I think the game was so heavily promoted, and kind of the way that it was marketed before it was being released is that this is the most realistic game ever made. And that wasn't just in terms of the kind of visual fidelity and the technology and the minutiae of detail. It was really about showing these kind of really vivid details of everyday life. And I mean, it's really surprising to me, or was really surprising, I suppose, when I played it. There are extended sections of the game where, you're not doing anything other than, riding across a landscape, or on an even more mundane level, literally building a house. You're hammering in kind of nails and putting together this kind of cabin that made out of wood. And the fact that Rockstar sort of put that as part of the story, like as part of the actual narrative-centered missions that you're completing, it really gives a sense that they were trying to sort of offer something that was very, as close as you could get to this perception that you were having this kind of lived experience of what it was like. In terms of this relationship then that it has to kind of historical accuracy, I think, the way that this franchise, the way that Rockstar has long sort of sought to market this is as something that's very realistic, that has this level of historical authenticity to it. So I think the more that they can say, look at all these tiny little details that we put into this game, look at all of these things that you can see and you can do, creating this sense that, if this is the most realistic game that's ever been made in terms of the history of the American West, then you're getting this more kind of like authentic experience. And that can be kind of negative because it's almost like perpetuating these stereotypes. Because if you think that all of the details, they've obviously taken huge amounts of time and energy and resource to put this game together, right? It's absolutely no mean feat, but you would perhaps then think, all right, well, this is the West. And really, it's a very kind of small image of the kinds of stories that could be told and the kinds of experiences that people had.
Now, we've mentioned Rockstar, which is the company that puts out Red Dead Redemption, and they have other very popular video games, one of which comes to mind is Grand Theft Auto. In your book, there's a very interesting article about the corporate culture of Rockstar. What has been Rockstar's philosophy or business plan when it comes to video game creation? Because these are the worlds that Rockstar creates, and we see that world through the game creator's eyes. I mean, what have been their statements with regard to Red Dead Redemption?
I think a large part, and I think we've touched on it before, a large part of what they really try to do, or what they have had as a core part of their philosophy, has been to kind of prove the cultural status or the cultural value of video games, and especially to do that relative to these more kind of established and traditional media industries like film and television. And really a large part of what they've sort of done in their marketing and when they sort of talk to the press is to talk about the fact that they try and use the kind of production that you would expect from a Hollywood movie or a big budget TV show, that they're really trying to prove to people that video games should be as kind of culturally important and respected as these other media industries, and to bring the kind of production value, I guess, to that, to make these kind of games that are equivalent to blockbusters.
John, what is your feeling?
I should say, I think Esther is the definite Rockstar expert at the book here, but I would say that Rockstar, they have a sense of, in their background, they're very much about a company who likes to play with controversy, to get attention, to create sales whatever way they can. And in the past, they've also provided quite satirical games and international or British games, looking in a sense at the American experience. Red Dead, in a way, marks a kind of more mature product at times for them, I feel. And definitely, like with Esther's point about art, I feel as though this is a case of trying to get really serious recognition for video games. And I think we've now reached that point that video games are certainly on a par with other media in that respect. But certainly this game has kind of pushed Rockstar in a kind of more of a mature outlook, I'd say.
I find it very fascinating that, these video games, as you said, are becoming the new media. I mean, these video games are becoming more and more influential in our society. I mean, for Red Dead, the Pinkerton Detective Agency actually sent a cease and desist letter to the game creators because they didn't like how they were being portrayed in the game. How much responsibility do game creators have now with regard to how they present materials in their games? I know Dan Houser from Rockstar said in the book, Red Dead Redemption may be a work of historical fiction, but it's not a work of history. I mean, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but it sounds like to me he's saying, hey, come on, people, it's just a game. The fact that he says it's historical fiction, does that relieve the game creators of responsibilities that other media outlets have? Esther, why don't you answer that one first?
No, I don't think so. I find that quote fascinating because it's clearly a sort of an attempt to just kind of put up some sort of shield in terms of the level of responsibility that they see themselves as having. But most historians probably wouldn't be that conservative about saying there's that much difference between, historical fiction and history. Even historical fictions, they're still making a kind of historical argument about what things are like. They just have a lot of fiction thrown in, right? Yeah. But yeah, I think especially for a company like Rockstar, that they are so influential. They make so much money. They have so many fans. They can sell product, right? They clearly are influential in terms of both the games industry, but they also have a wider influence in terms of the kinds of films and TV shows that get made. What was really interesting a couple of years ago when the Westworld, the new kind of HBO series came out, the showrunners really credited Red Dead Redemption as one of the things that they were really inspired by, which is again, fascinating because we already had a Westworld, right? Like we had the film, which obviously probably inspired Red Dead Redemption as a game. So you've got this kind of this cycle that Red Dead is feeding into in terms of making the Western popular again, as well as kind of being the sort of video game franchise that can inspire other media. So I think there's a lot of responsibility then in terms of the kinds of stories that they choose to tell, because people, younger people, or even older people, and international audiences, they might not be so accustomed, or they might not be so so familiar with the Western genre and all of the different kinds of films or TV shows that there have been over, a century or more. But if their only kind of viewpoint into this period, into this history, is this franchise, then you might come away with that with a very specific perception about, like I've said already, whose stories are important and whose are less important, I guess.
John, what do you think? What are the responsibilities of the game creators nowadays?
Well, it reminds me a bit of a course I was teaching a couple of years ago about the American West, about the history of the West, and students would turn up to class. And I'd say, maybe like, what Westerns have you seen? Have you visited the US much? And a huge number of them said, well, we've played Red Dead Redemption. That is their one reference. That is what they think is the West. And, in a way, that's quite, it's great. I mean, it's great that they're playing that game. But it's also shocking because it really highlights Setter's point that this creates a narrow vision of the past. And with that narrow vision, there needs to be some element of responsibility. If you've got millions of people watching, spending hours, 100+ hours people can play this game, there comes an element whereby you need to take responsibility for what you're promoting. And, there's some excellent points within this game, but as we've said already, there's some problematic interpretations too. So I think games developers do need to think about carefully their ethical considerations, how they're presenting the United States, what they're doing with their games. These are not frivolous, throwaway entertainment products. And if you spend 8 years developing something, that's definitely not frivolous or throwaway. So, we need to hold them to that. That said, I think also, we should also allow for some creativity here. We don't want, a litigious world whereby, you're putting somebody on screen and then the next minute you're being kind of sued for it. Yeah. So, there needs to be a balance. There needs to be a balance here. But I do think, Rockstar, they can be quite flippant over some of these issues, really.
Now, the Red Dead Redemption series made Rockstar a lot of money, and it's an extremely popular video game. A lot of people play Red Dead Redemption. Marshall McLuhan said the games of people reveal a great deal about them. What do you think the popularity of Red Dead Redemption reveals about us, the people who play it, and society who plays it and buys the game? Esther, what do you think?
I think a lot of people over the years and decades, film critics, film historians have wanted to say that the Western is dead or dying, right? The Western will never kind of have a resurgence, all of that. I think it really just proves that, like, how important the story of the American West is to not just American history and kind of American popular consciousness, but clearly on a global scale, right? In terms of how people think about what American history is. Like, it's obviously such a defining period, a defining set of ideas and stories and a very like audio-visual sort of sense of the past as well, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's really interesting in terms of this is the newest media form. This is games. They're not that old, but the fact that we are still kind of using this medium to tell these kind of origin myths almost of the United States is really, really interesting and important for academics, for critics, but also for players to think about why that might be in the present moment.
John, what do you think?
I think for me, the game I play it, so I played it because, I personally love the West. The West is, in a way, like my second home, and I spent lots of time there. And, the history, the myth, the West, it's all part of this game. So I think that for some people, it plays to some already established fondness for that time and that place. I think for other people, there's the idea of maybe playing something different from, a sci-fi shooter or a first-person shooter in World War II. This is a kind of different theme. It's a different experience that you can have. You're still doing shooting. You're still doing some of the same kind of activities, but you're doing it in a different play world. And I think Red Dead is great at providing a very immersive and really kind of quite magical experience that way.
So where do you both see this series headed? I mean, what do you see next for the video game Western? I mean, do you think we're going to have more zombies, which kind of threw me for a bit with the section of that series? But where do you see Red Dead Redemption series going? Esther, why don't you go first?
It's hard to think about, or it's hard to imagine, I guess, technologically speaking, how they can sort of better this, really, in terms of if we're thinking about pure kind of achievement on a sort of a technological and audiovisual level. This game is the Red Dead Redemption 2 is vast and detailed, and I think if we have this kind of technology, games do have this technology, and technology is getting better all the time, right? So sort of to simulate these kinds of past worlds, I think it would be nice to sort of see Rockstar put that kind of technological ability and the kind of resources they have to still imagining this kind of world and these kind of experiences, but maybe kind of taking a slightly different perspective, maybe a bit more of an inclusive perspective, or just something that shines a light on maybe some of the other stories that could be told in the history of the American West. I mean, we have what people have been asking for a long time with the new installment of the Grand Theft Auto franchise coming out, to finally have looks like it's going to have a woman as one of the playable characters. So I think that if they would be interested, or Rockstar would be interested or willing in actually pushing this forward, not just in terms of the kind of technological capabilities that they have, but also in terms of the representativeness of the stories that they're telling, I think that would be really interesting to see. And again, if they're going to offer this kind of experience that is so, obviously interesting and exciting to people, that they can afford to kind of, tell different kinds of stories and show different kinds of perspectives while they do so.
John, where do you think this series is headed?
I think it's quite challenging. I think, like Esther said, that what do we do with a game? Rockstar has these challenges with its whole franchises, really, doesn't it? That if you've got 8-10 year game development cycles, that's very that's a big challenge, and it also makes them want to play safe, doesn't it? Because they're investing so much money, they do not want to take too many risks. So I think that, hopefully there will be another iteration of it, and hopefully it will have, more diverse characters to it, or a different lens on the West, away from a male lens on it, would be great. But I also think it's quite a challenge to do video game Westerns. I mean, if we look, I looked earlier today, and it's actually quite hard to find other recent Western set games.
Really?
I came across one that was called Cowboy Life Simulator.
Okay.
That's about it. There isn't much out there. And so I think, in a sense, it almost seems almost a risk just to do a video game Western now. So I don't think we can maybe expect too much kind of radical reinvention there. But hopefully there'll be more on the way.
Esther, John, we're running out of time, but can you give out a website where people can pick up the book, or Red Dead Redemption, History, Myth, and Violence in the Video Game West? And if you have any social media addresses you want to give out, please do so.
The book you can get direct from the University of Oklahoma Press. It's in paperback and hardback and ebook, but also it's available as an audiobook too, if people prefer to listen to their books that way, on Audible, Google Play, all the usual places that you can get audiobooks. It's also on Amazon. It should be, in theory, pretty easy to find as a book if people are interested in reading it.
So if you guys have any social media addresses you want to give out so people can follow and see what new things you have in store for Red Dead Redemption?
Yeah, I don't know about you, Esther. I'm on Twitter or X for my sins. So at Dr. John W, say DRJONW. I'm on that. I'm also, at the University of Kent, and I have a web page there. And you can get in touch with me through my email on the webpage. But I think that's about me. How about you, Esther?
Yeah, likewise. You can find me on if you Google Esther Wright Cardiff, I should come up with my email address and other sort of contact details. I'm also, again, for my sins, still on Twitter or X. It's at Esther Wright _ so it's ESTHERWRIGH _ and I'm also on Blue Sky Social at EN Wright.
John Wills and Esther Wright, thank you so much for coming on and talking about your book, Red Dead Redemption, History, Myth, and Violence in the Video Game West. It's an incredibly interesting look at one of the most popular video games out there. Fans of the game should really enjoy the insights that your book presents. Thank you so much for taking the time and telling us all about it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. It's been great talking to you.
That'll do it for us this week. We'll see you next time on The Turnpike.